The frost had painted intricate patterns across the kitchen window during the night, delicate crystalline webs that caught the pale December morning light. Silas Hartwell stood motionless before the glass, his small palms pressed flat against the cold surface, watching his breath create tiny clouds that obscured his reflection. The warmth from his hands had begun to melt the frost beneath his touch, creating two perfect oval clearings in the winter's artwork. "Silas, breakfast is ready," Ruth Hartwell called from behind him, her voice carrying the gentle firmness that mothers reserve for dawdling children. She stood at the wooden table, ladling hot porridge into two earthenware bowls, steam rising from the meal like morning mist. "Come away from that window before you catch your death." The house remained silent except for the soft scraping of her wooden spoon against the bowl's rim. Ruth turned, expecting to see her 11-year-old son reluctantly abandoning his post at the window, but instead found herself staring at empty air. The space where Silas had been standing moments before contained nothing but dancing dust motes caught in the early sunlight. "Silas?" Her voice carried a note of confusion now, not yet panic, just the mild bewilderment of a mother whose child had disappeared between one breath and the next. She set down the ladle and moved toward the window, her woolen skirts rustling against the rough floorboards. On the frost-covered glass, two hand-shaped impressions remained, the warmth of living palms still melting the ice in slow, trickling streams. The imprints were perfect, complete down to the tiny lines of his palms and the small whorls of his fingertips. Ruth reached out to touch the spots, feeling the residual warmth that proved her son had been there just seconds ago. "Silas, this isn't funny," she called, her voice echoing through the small cottage. "Come out this instant." She began searching with the methodical thoroughness that comes naturally to mothers. First the pantry, where he sometimes hid when avoiding chores. Then behind the heavy oak table where he'd once successfully concealed himself during a game. Her calls grew more urgent as she climbed the narrow stairs to the loft where he slept, her footsteps creating a desperate rhythm on the worn wooden steps. "Silas. Silas, where are you?" Each room revealed nothing but shadows and the lingering scent of wood smoke from the previous night's fire. His small bed remained neatly made, the patchwork quilt pulled tight across the straw mattress. His few possessions sat exactly where he'd left them the night before, a carved wooden horse, a collection of smooth river stones, a primer with its pages softened by countless readings. Ruth's breathing had become shallow, her chest tight with the first tendrils of genuine fear. She rushed back downstairs and flung open the front door, the cold December air hitting her like a physical blow. The snow lay pristine and undisturbed across their small yard, no footprints marring its perfect surface. "Thomas," she screamed toward the smithy where her husband would already be stoking his forge. "Thomas, come quickly." The urgency in her voice brought Thomas Hartwell running, his leather apron still tied around his waist, his hands black with coal dust. Behind him came their nearest neighbor, Ezekiel Morrison, who had been delivering horseshoes for repair. "What's happened?" Thomas demanded, but Ruth could only point at the empty kitchen, at the handprints still visible on the window, at the untouched bowls of porridge growing cold on the table. "He was right there," she whispered. "I turned around for just a moment." Other neighbors began to gather as word spread through the small community. In a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, the disappearance of a child sent ripples of alarm through every household. The women clustered around Ruth, offering comfort and theories, while the men organized themselves into search parties. It was young Benjamin Morrison who found the first clue. "Ma," he called from the edge of the Hartwell property. "There's tracks here, leading toward the cemetery." The group converged on the spot where Benjamin pointed. In the snow, barely visible unless one looked carefully, was a single line of small footprints. They were shallow, as if made by someone walking with unusual lightness, and they led in a perfectly straight line toward the old congregational cemetery that crowned the hill overlooking Millfield. The searchers followed the trail in tense silence, their own heavy boots creating a chaotic pattern around the delicate line of Silas's passage. The footprints never deviated, never showed signs of running or hesitation, just a steady, purposeful progression up the snowy slope. They found him standing before a weathered granite headstone, his small figure dark against the white expanse of the cemetery. His back was straight, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. His lips were moving in what appeared to be silent conversation, forming words that made no sound in the cold morning air. "Silas," Ruth breathed, relief flooding her voice. She started toward him, but Thomas caught her arm. Something in the boy's posture, in the absolute stillness of his stance, made them all hesitate. He stood as if carved from the same stone as the monuments around him, oblivious to their presence despite their obvious approach. "Silas," Thomas called, his voice carrying the authority of fatherhood. "Son, come away from there." The boy's lips continued their silent motion, but he gave no other sign of having heard. Thomas moved closer, his boots crunching in the snow, and reached out to touch his son's shoulder. At the contact, Silas turned, his pale blue eyes focusing on his father's face with perfect clarity. "Are you hurt?" Thomas asked. "What are you doing out here?" Silas nodded in response to the first question and shook his head to the second, but he did not speak. His gaze was alert and intelligent, showing no signs of confusion or distress, yet when Thomas repeated his name, "Silas, answer me," something changed in the boy's expression. It was subtle at first, a tightening around his eyes, a slight drawing back as if the sound of his own name caused him physical discomfort. When Thomas said it again, more firmly, Silas actually flinched, his small body recoiling as if struck. "What's wrong with him?" Ruth whispered, kneeling in the snow beside her son. "Silas, sweetheart, it's Mama." This time the reaction was unmistakable. At the sound of his name, Silas's eyes went completely blank, staring through his mother as if she had become invisible. His body remained present, responsive to touch and gesture, but something essential had withdrawn, leaving behind a hollow shell that breathed and blinked but showed no recognition of the word that should have been most familiar to him. By afternoon, Dr. Ezra Whitmore had been summoned from his practice in the village center. He arrived at the Hartwell cottage with his leather medical bag and the bearing of a man accustomed to solving problems through careful observation and logical deduction. His education at Harvard Medical School had prepared him for many mysteries of the human body, but nothing in his training had equipped him for what he discovered that day. The boy sat calmly in the kitchen chair where his parents had placed him, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He responded appropriately to every stimulus Dr. Whitmore applied, following the movement of a finger with his eyes, allowing his pulse to be taken, even opening his mouth obediently when asked to say, "Ah." But when the doctor addressed him by name, introducing himself with, "Hello, Silas," the child's face became a mask of polite incomprehension. "Can you tell me your name?" Dr. Whitmore asked. Silas tilted his head, considering the question with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a difficult puzzle. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound emerged. He tried again, his lips forming what might have been the beginning of a word, but then his expression clouded with something that looked almost like fear. "Try pointing to yourself," the doctor suggested. The boy's hand rose partway to his chest, then stopped, hovering in the air as if he had forgotten what the gesture was supposed to accomplish. His eyes held a strange mixture of confusion and terror, as if the very concept of selfhood had become foreign to him. Dr. Whitmore spent 2 hours conducting the most thorough examination of his career. He tested the boy's hearing, his vision, his reflexes, his ability to understand and follow complex instructions. In every aspect except one, Silas Hartwell appeared to be a perfectly normal, healthy 11-year-old child. The single exception was his complete inability to acknowledge or respond to his own name, as if that particular combination of sounds held no meaning for him whatsoever. As the winter afternoon faded into early darkness, Dr. Whitmore found himself documenting the most perplexing case he had ever encountered. In his neat physician's handwriting, he recorded his observations. Subject responds to all external stimuli with appropriate recognition and compliance. Demonstrates normal cognitive function in all areas of testing. Shows no signs of physical trauma, illness, or neurological impairment. However, exhibits complete dissociation from personal identity markers, most notably his given name, which appears to cause genuine distress when spoken in his presence. The doctor closed his journal and looked across the kitchen at the boy who sat so quietly, so patiently, waiting for whatever would happen next. In Silas's pale blue eyes, he saw intelligence, awareness, even a kind of sad understanding. But he also saw something else, something that made him deeply uneasy, a hollowness, as if some essential part of the child had been carefully carved out and taken away. Have you ever felt your own name become a stranger to you? Tell us about a moment when you didn't recognize yourself. Dr. Ezra Whitmore adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles as he approached the Hartwell cottage, his leather medical bag weighing heavy in his gloved hand. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered yard, and he could see faces peering from behind frost-etched windows in neighboring houses. The entire village of Millfield was holding its breath, waiting to understand what had befallen the blacksmith's son. Ruth Hartwell opened the door before he could knock, her eyes red-rimmed from crying and sleepless worry. "Doctor, thank God you've come. He's been sitting in the same chair since we brought him back from the cemetery. He won't eat, won't speak, won't even look at us when we say his." She stopped herself, glancing toward the kitchen where a small figure sat motionless. "When you say his what, Mrs. Hartwell?" Whitmore asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "His name," she whispered. "Something happens when we say his name." Whitmore had practiced medicine for 15 years, first in Boston's crowded tenements and now in this remote Vermont village where broken bones and difficult births comprised the bulk of his work. His Harvard education had instilled in him a deep belief in observable phenomena and logical explanations. Every symptom had a cause, every illness followed predictable patterns, and the human mind, however complex, operated according to principles that could be studied and understood. Yet as he entered the Hartwell kitchen and observed the boy sitting with supernatural stillness in the wooden chair, Whitmore felt the first stirrings of doubt about the adequacy of his medical training. The child appeared completely normal, clear-eyed, alert, breathing regularly, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was listening to something no one else could hear. "Good morning," Whitmore said, setting his bag on the table. "I'm Dr. Whitmore. I'd like to examine you, if that's all right." The boy turned toward him with a polite smile, nodding once in acknowledgement. His blue eyes were bright with intelligence, showing no signs of fever, injury, or mental distress. "Can you tell me how you're feeling?" Whitmore asked. A slight tilt of the head, as if considering the question, then a shrug that seemed to say he felt perfectly fine. "Are you in any pain?" A shake of the head, clear and definitive. "Can you follow my finger with your eyes?" The boy tracked the movement perfectly, his gaze steady and focused. Whitmore continued with a series of simple commands: touch your nose, wiggle your fingers, stand up, sit down, and each was obeyed without hesitation. "Excellent," Whitmore murmured, making notes in his journal. "Now, can you tell me your name?" The change was immediate and unsettling. The boy's expression didn't shift toward confusion or defiance, but rather toward a kind of careful blankness, as if the question had been asked in a language he didn't understand. His mouth opened slightly, closed, then opened again, but no sound emerged. "Try again," Whitmore encouraged. "What do people call you?" This time there was a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or recognition of a trap he couldn't avoid. The boy's hands began to tremble almost imperceptibly, though his face remained composed. Thomas Hartwell, who had been standing silently by the fireplace, cleared his throat. "Doctor, maybe you should try calling him something else." "Such as?" "The child," Thomas said carefully. "Or him." Or, the blacksmith's son. Whitmore raised an eyebrow but decided to humor the suggestion. Can you touch your nose for me, child? Immediately, the boy's hand rose to his nose, his movements natural and unforced. Very good. Now, can you clap your hands, son? Again, perfect compliance. Fascinating, Whitmore murmured, scribbling furiously in his journal. And if I were to use his given name? Please don't, Ruth said quickly. Not unless you have to. It upsets him terribly. But Whitmore's scientific curiosity was fully aroused now. He had never encountered anything like this selective response pattern. The boy clearly understood language, could process complex instructions, and showed no signs of hearing impairment. Why would one specific word, his own name, cause such a dramatic reaction? I need to understand the parameters of this condition, Whitmore said. Silas. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The boy went rigid in his chair, his eyes widening with unmistakable terror. His breathing became shallow and rapid, but he made no sound, as if his vocal cords had been severed. Tears began streaming down his cheeks, though his expression remained frozen in that mask of silent panic. Stop, Ruth pleaded. Please, you're hurting him. Whitmore immediately ceased his examination, disturbed by the intensity of the child's reaction. Within moments, the boy's breathing returned to normal, the tears stopped, and his expression cleared as if nothing had happened. I've never seen anything like it, Whitmore admitted, closing his journal. Mr. Hartwell, I'd like to speak with you privately. They stepped outside into the bitter December air, their breath forming clouds in the frigid atmosphere. Thomas pulled his coat tight around his shoulders and glanced back at the cottage where his wife was attempting to coax their son into drinking some warm milk. How long has this been going on? Whitmore asked. The not speaking. Since yesterday morning. But he's been different, 4 weeks now. Different how? Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his boots crunching in the snow. Strange things. Talking to empty corners like someone was standing there. Asking questions that didn't make sense. What kind of questions? About names, mostly. Who decides what they mean? Whether a person could exist without one. Last week he asked me if I'd still be his father if he wasn't called Silas anymore. Thomas's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Doctor, I think something's wrong with his mind. Not broken, exactly, but changed. Whitmore studied the blacksmith's weathered face, seeing genuine fear beneath the man's stoic exterior. Has he mentioned seeing or hearing anything unusual? He said the headstones in the cemetery were talking to him. Old Jeremiah's in particular. Jeremiah? My grandfather. Died before Silas was born, but the boy's always been drawn to that grave. Sometimes I'd find him up there, just sitting by the stone for hours. A chill ran down Whitmore's spine, though he told himself it was merely the winter air. Mr. Hartwell, I'd like to try one more test, with your permission. Something that might help me understand what's happening to your son. Thomas nodded reluctantly, and they returned to the warm kitchen where Silas sat exactly as they had left him, staring at something in the middle distance that only he could see. Whitmore opened his journal to a fresh page and carefully wrote in large, clear letters, Silas. He tore the page out and folded it so the name wasn't visible, then approached the boy. I'm going to show you something, he said gently. I want you to look at it and tell me what you think. He unfolded the paper and held it where the boy could see it clearly. The reaction was beyond anything Whitmore had anticipated. Silas's entire body began convulsing as if he were having a seizure, his small frame racked with violent tremors. His eyes rolled back, showing only white, and tears poured down his face in torrents. But throughout the entire episode, he made absolutely no sound, not a cry, not a whimper, not even the involuntary gasps that usually accompanied such physical distress. Whitmore immediately crumpled the paper and threw it into the fireplace, but the convulsions continued for several long, terrifying seconds before gradually subsiding. When they finally stopped, Silas slumped in his chair, exhausted but conscious, his pale face streaked with tear tracks. "My God," Whitmore breathed, his hands shaking as he made notes about what he had witnessed. "What have we done to you, child?" But as he looked into the boy's eyes, now calm and alert once again, he realized the more pressing question was not what had been done, but what was still being done, and by whom. The morning after his disturbing experiment with the written name, Dr. Whitmore found himself walking the frozen paths between Millfield's modest houses, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air as he sought answers that conventional medicine could not provide. If Silas Hartwell's condition defied medical explanation, perhaps the solution lay buried in the family's past, in the stories that old people whispered by firelight when they thought no one was listening. His first stop was the home of Mercy Blackwood, the village's eldest resident at 83 years old. She sat hunched in a rocking chair by her hearth, her gnarled fingers working steadily at a piece of knitting that seemed to have no discernible pattern. Her milky eyes fixed on Whitmore with surprising sharpness when he mentioned the Hartwell name. "Jeremiah Hartwell," she said, her voice like rustling leaves. "Now there's a name I haven't heard spoken aloud in near 50 years. Most folks around here learned it was better not to mention him. What can you tell me about him?" Whitmore asked, settling into the chair she indicated. Mercy's knitting needles paused in their rhythmic clicking. "Jeremiah was Thomas's grandfather, died when I was just a girl. But Lord help me, I remember him clear as yesterday. Tall man, always dressed in black, with eyes that seemed to look right through you. He'd show up at the revival meetings, and when the Spirit took hold of him, he'd speak in tongues like nothing you ever heard. That's not uncommon in religious communities," Whitmore observed. This was different, Mercy insisted, her voice dropping to a whisper. The sounds that came out of that man weren't any earthly language. Made your skin crawl just to hear them. And the things he'd say when the fit passed, prophecies about death and judgment, but spoken like he was reading from a book only he could see. Whitmore leaned forward. "How did he die?" "Found him in the woods one morning, sitting against an old oak tree like he'd just decided to rest there. No wounds, no signs of illness. Just, empty. Like something had reached inside and taken the life right out of him." She resumed her knitting with renewed intensity. "His last words, according to those who found him, were, 'The debt passes down.'" From Mercy's cottage, Whitmore made his way to the white-steepled Congregational Church where Reverend Cornelius Marsh kept the village's official records. The pastor was a thin, nervous man who seemed perpetually startled by his own shadow, and when Whitmore asked about the Hartwell family history, Marsh's hands began to tremble visibly. "I'm not sure those records would be helpful," Marsh said, wringing his hands. "Some family histories are better left undisturbed. Reverend, a child's welfare is at stake. I need to understand what might be affecting him." With obvious reluctance, Marsh led Whitmore to a small room behind the pulpit where church records were stored in wooden cabinets that smelled of age and forgotten secrets. He pulled out a leather-bound volume and opened it to pages that seemed darker than the rest, as if they had been handled with reluctant frequency. "3 generations," Marsh said quietly, running his finger down entries written in various hands. "All the Hartwell men, afflicted with what I can only describe as spiritual disturbances." The records painted a disturbing pattern. Jeremiah Hartwell's entries spoke of divine revelations and communion with celestial forces, followed by increasingly erratic behavior and finally complete withdrawal from all religious observance. Thomas's father, Josiah, was described as suffering from profound melancholia that began in his 30s and deepened until he could no longer bear to hear hymns or prayers spoken in his presence. "And Thomas?" Whitmore asked. Marsh hesitated. Thomas stopped attending services the day Silas was born. Said he couldn't stomach being in God's house anymore, though he wouldn't say why. I've tried to counsel him, but... The pastor shook his head. It's as if something in that family line is fundamentally incompatible with divine grace. Have you ever heard stories about Jeremiah making some sort of bargain? The question made Marsh go pale. Where did you hear that? Is it true? There are stories. Old stories that decent folk don't repeat. They say Jeremiah was desperate to lift his family out of poverty, that he ventured into the deep woods where civilized men don't go, seeking something that would ensure his bloodline's prosperity. Marsh closed the record book with trembling hands. The stories say he found it. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow, Whitmore made his most difficult visit, to the bedside of Constance Hartwell, Thomas's mother, who had been confined to her room for the past 3 years with what the family diplomatically called nervous exhaustion. The old woman lay propped against yellowed pillows, her wild gray hair spread around her head like a storm cloud, her eyes holding the particular brightness that comes with madness or revelation. Thomas led Whitmore up the narrow stairs to his mother's room, his heavy footsteps creating an ominous rhythm on the wooden boards. She has good days and bad days, he warned. Today might be neither. Constance Hartwell turned her head when they entered, and her gaze immediately fixed on Whitmore with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Her lips began moving before she spoke, as if she were practicing words that were difficult to pronounce. "You're the doctor," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Come about the boy." "Yes, ma'am. I'm trying to understand what's happening to your grandson." "Grandson?" She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Is that what he still is?" "I'm not so sure anymore." Thomas shifted nervously by the door. "Mother, please." "Hush, Thomas. The doctor needs to know." Constance pulled herself higher against her pillows, her eyes never leaving Whitmore's face. "Jeremiah made a bargain, you know. Deep in the woods where the old things still live. Traded away pieces of our souls for prosperity that would last through the generations." "What kind of bargain?" Whitmore asked, ignoring Thomas's warning glance. "Each generation has to give up something precious," she whispered, her voice taking on a sing-song quality. "Jeremiah gave up his ability to pray, couldn't speak to God anymore, no matter how hard he tried. My husband Josiah gave up his capacity for joy, spent the last 20 years of his life without ever feeling a moment's happiness." "And Thomas?" Constance's gaze shifted to her son, and for a moment her expression held infinite sadness. "Thomas gave up his hope. Haven't you noticed, Doctor? He doesn't believe in tomorrow anymore. Hasn't for years." "What about Silas?" Whitmore asked quietly. "Poor little lamb," Constance murmured, tears beginning to flow down her wrinkled cheeks. "He's giving up the biggest thing of all. His very self. His name, his identity, everything that makes him who he is. It's being taken away piece by piece until there'll be nothing left but an empty shell for something else to fill." "Something else?" But Constance had turned her face to the wall and would say no more, no matter how gently Whitmore pressed her. When he returned to the Hartwell cottage that evening to check on his patient, Whitmore found Silas exactly where he had left him that morning, sitting in the kitchen chair, staring at something only he could see. But now there was something different, something that made Whitmore's medical instincts prickle with alarm. The boy was methodically washing his hands. Ruth had placed a basin of warm water beside his chair, and Silas was dipping his small hands into it repeatedly, scrubbing at his palms with a piece of rough cloth as if trying to remove some invisible stain. His movements were compulsive, repetitive, mechanical, wash, scrub, rinse, repeat, over and over in an endless cycle. "How long has he been doing this?" Whitmore asked. "Since noon," Ruth replied, her voice tight with worry. I've changed the water 4 times. His hands are getting raw, but he won't stop. If I try to take the basin away, he becomes agitated. Whitmore observed the boy's technique, noting the particular attention he paid to his palms, scrubbing them as if something vital depended on getting them perfectly clean. But clean of what? There was nothing visible on the child's hands, no dirt or stain that soap and water could remove. "Silas," he said softly, then caught himself. "Child, can you tell me what you're trying to wash off?" The boy paused in his scrubbing and looked up at Whitmore with those unnaturally clear blue eyes. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again. But this time, instead of the frustrated confusion Whitmore had seen before, there was something else in the child's expression, a kind of horrified understanding, as if he knew exactly what he was trying to wash away but lacked the words to explain it. Then Silas returned to his washing, his small hands moving with renewed urgency, scrubbing at palms that would never be clean again. The bells of Millfield's Congregational Church rang out across the snow-covered village that Sunday morning, their bronze voices calling the faithful to worship as they had for nearly a century. Dr. Whitmore walked beside the Hartwell family along the well-worn path to the white-steepled building, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid December air. He had suggested attending the service, hoping that familiar surroundings and routine might somehow reach whatever remained of Silas beneath the strange affliction that had claimed him. Thomas walked with reluctant steps, his shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. He had not set foot inside the church since his son's birth 11 years ago, and Whitmore could see the tension radiating from every line of his body. Ruth clutched her worn prayer book with white knuckles, her eyes red from another sleepless night spent watching Silas wash his hands in an endless, futile cycle. The boy himself moved between his parents with that same mechanical precision that had characterized all his actions since the morning he vanished from the kitchen. His small hands, now raw and chapped from constant scrubbing, hung at his sides as he walked, but Whitmore noticed they still made tiny washing motions, his fingers rubbing against his palms in a rhythm that never ceased. Inside the church, the familiar sense of beeswax candles and old wood should have been comforting, but something felt different to Whitmore as they found their seats in a middle pew. The air seemed heavier than usual, charged with an expectancy that made the hair on his arms stand up beneath his wool coat. Other parishioners turned to stare at the Hartwell family, their faces showing mixtures of curiosity and poorly concealed fear. Reverend Marsh appeared even more nervous than usual as he took his place at the pulpit, his hands trembling so violently that the pages of his sermon rustled audibly in the silence. His voice cracked as he began the opening prayer, and Whitmore noticed how his eyes kept drifting toward the pew where Silas sat motionless between his parents. "Let us bow our heads and open our hearts to the Lord's presence," Marsh intoned, his words echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The congregation obediently lowered their heads, but Silas remained upright, his pale blue eyes fixed on something at the front of the church that only he could see. As the Reverend's prayer continued, asking for divine guidance and protection for all the faithful, something began to change in the boy's posture. It started as a barely perceptible tremor, a slight shaking of his head that might have been mistaken for restlessness. But the movement grew more pronounced, more frantic, until Silas was shaking his head violently from side to side, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as if he were trying desperately to speak. Ruth reached for her son's hand, but he pulled away, his agitation increasing. He began pointing at his own chest with increasing desperation, jabbing at his sternum with his small index finger as if trying to indicate something vital that others couldn't see. His mouth worked frantically, forming shapes that might have been words if any sound had emerged from his throat. Young Timothy Morrison, seated 2 pews behind the Hartwells, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mama," he whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the church's acoustics. "I can hear something when I look at that boy." "Hush," his mother replied, but other children had begun to murmur similar observations. "It's like someone calling from far away," whispered Sarah Blackwood, Mercy's granddaughter. "Not words," added Benjamin Morrison. "Something underneath words." The whispers spread through the congregation like ripples on water, and even the adults began to strain their ears, listening for something they couldn't quite identify. Reverend Marsh's prayer faltered as he became aware of the growing disturbance, his voice trailing off into an uncertain silence. That's when Silas stood. The movement was so sudden and unexpected that it startled everyone in his immediate vicinity. He rose from the pew with mechanical precision, his back straight and his movements eerily purposeful. Without looking at his parents or acknowledging their alarmed whispers, he stepped into the aisle and began walking toward the front of the church. "Silas," Ruth called softly, starting to rise, but Thomas caught her arm. "Let him go," he said, his voice hollow. "Whatever's happening, we can't stop it." The boy's footsteps echoed on the wooden floor as he walked down the center aisle, his pace steady and measured. He moved like someone following a route he had traveled many times before, though Whitmore knew this was his first time in the church since infancy. The congregation watched in stunned silence as the small figure approached the altar area, where the baptismal font stood gleaming in the morning light that streamed through stained glass windows. Silas stopped directly in front of the marble font, its basin filled with holy water that reflected the colored light from above. For a long moment, he simply stood there, motionless as a statue, while the entire congregation held its collective breath. Then he leaned forward and stared into the water. What happened next would haunt Dr. Whitmore's dreams for the rest of his life. The boy's reflection in the holy water seemed to move independently of his physical form, creating a disturbing doubling effect that made Whitmore's eyes water when he tried to focus on it. Silas raised his hands to his face, but instead of the gentle touching motions one might expect, he began clawing at his own skin with desperate ferocity. His small fingernails raked across his cheeks and forehead, leaving angry red scratches as he tried to tear at something that wasn't visible to the watching congregation. His movements were frantic, desperate, as if he were trying to remove a mask that had been sealed to his flesh. The scratches began to bleed, thin lines of crimson that stood out starkly against his pale skin. "Stop him!" Ruth cried out, but when Dr. Whitmore rose and started toward the altar, something in the boy's posture warned him to keep his distance. For the first time since his mutism had begun, sound emerged from Silas Hartwell's throat. But it wasn't speech, wasn't even a recognizable human vocalization. It was a low, keening wail that seemed to originate from somewhere much deeper than his lungs, a sound of such profound grief and despair that it resonated in the bones of everyone who heard it. The wail grew in volume and intensity, filling the church with its mournful resonance. It was the sound of someone mourning their own death, of a soul crying out in recognition of its complete and utter loss. The acoustic properties of the church amplified the sound until it seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if the very building were keening in sympathy. Several parishioners fled immediately, unable to bear the inhuman sound. Others pressed their hands to their ears, tears streaming down their faces as the wail penetrated their defenses and touched something primal and terrified in their hearts. Even Reverend Marsh stumbled backward from his pulpit, his face gone white with shock. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the sound itself, it was the way it seemed to echo, as if there were other voices joining in from some distant place. Hidden harmonies wove through the boy's anguished cry, creating a chorus of loss that spoke of generations of suffering, of sacrifices made and prices paid in blood and spirit. Dr. Whitmore found himself paralyzed, unable to approach the child who stood clawing at his face while that terrible sound poured from his throat. In his medical training, he had heard the cries of the dying, the screams of the wounded, the moans of the diseased. But this sound belonged to none of those categories. This was the voice of something being systematically unmade, dissolved from within until nothing remained but the echo of what it had once been. The wail continued for what felt like hours but could only have been minutes, until suddenly it cut off mid-note, leaving the church in a silence so complete that the absence of sound felt like a physical weight. Silas lowered his hands from his torn face and turned to look at the scattered congregation with eyes that held no recognition of where he was or who they were. Blood trickled from the scratches he had inflicted on himself, but his expression showed no pain, no awareness of injury. He looked like someone who had just awakened from a dream so vivid that reality seemed foreign and strange. "Child," Dr. Whitmore said softly, taking a careful step forward. "Are you hurt?" But Silas had already begun walking back down the aisle, moving with that same mechanical precision that characterized all his actions now. He returned to his pew and sat between his parents as if nothing had happened, folding his hands in his lap and staring straight ahead with that empty, waiting expression that had become so familiar. The service never resumed. One by one, the remaining congregation members filed out of the church, many of them weeping, all of them changed by what they had witnessed. As Dr. Whitmore helped escort the Hartwell family home, he found himself wondering if what they had seen was the final dissolution of Silas Hartwell, or merely the beginning of something far worse taking his place. The scratches on the boy's face had already begun to heal with unnatural speed, but the sound of that keening wail continued to echo in Whitmore's mind, a mournful reminder that some losses are so complete they leave echoes that never fade. Dr. Whitmore arrived at the Hartwell cottage on Monday morning to find Ruth standing in the doorway, her face etched with a new kind of desperation that went beyond the familiar worry of the past week. She clutched a small wooden horse in her hands, one of Silas's treasured possessions, and her knuckles were white from gripping it so tightly. "He doesn't know what it is," she said without preamble, holding up the carved toy. "I showed him his horse, the one Thomas made for his 6th birthday, and he looked at it like he'd never seen it before in his life." Whitmore set down his medical bag and followed Ruth into the kitchen, where Silas sat in his usual chair, his hands moving in those endless washing motions that had become as natural as breathing. The boy looked up when they entered, and his expression was politely curious, the way one might regard helpful strangers in an unfamiliar place. "Good morning," Whitmore said carefully. "How are you feeling today?" Silas tilted his head and smiled, a pleasant, empty expression that acknowledged the greeting without any warmth of recognition. It was the smile one might give to a shopkeeper or a passing acquaintance, devoid of the deeper connection that should have existed between doctor and patient after days of examination. "May I show you something?" Whitmore asked, producing a pencil and a sheet of paper from his bag. "I'd like you to draw a picture of yourself." The boy accepted the pencil with the compliance that had characterized all his responses, but his grip was awkward, as if he were trying to remember how such an implement should be held. He stared at the blank paper for a long moment, then began to draw with careful, deliberate strokes. What emerged under his pencil was profoundly disturbing in its simplicity. A perfect circle, drawn with mathematical precision. Within the circle, 2 dots for eyes, placed with careful symmetry. Nothing else, no nose, no mouth, no hair, no distinguishing features of any kind. Just the basic framework of a face reduced to its most elementary components. "Is this how you see yourself?" Whitmore asked gently. Silas studied the drawing with the same detached curiosity he had shown toward the wooden horse, as if he were examining someone else's artwork. He nodded once, apparently satisfied with his creation, then set the pencil aside and resumed his hand-washing motions. Whitmore felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December cold seeping through the cottage walls. The drawing wasn't the work of a confused child, it was the product of someone who had lost access to the concept of individual identity itself. The boy wasn't drawing what he looked like, he was drawing the only visual framework he could still recognize as human. "Ruth," Whitmore said quietly, "may I speak with you and Thomas privately?" They stepped into the small parlor adjacent to the kitchen, leaving Silas alone with his endless ritual of cleansing hands that would never be clean. Thomas looked haggard, his usually neat appearance disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "He's forgetting everything," Ruth whispered. "Not just his name, but everything that makes him who he is. Yesterday I asked him about his friend Benjamin, and he looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. This morning he couldn't remember which bed was his. It's getting worse," Thomas added, his voice hollow. Sometimes he stares at us like he's trying to remember why we're important to him, but he can't quite grasp it. Whitmore nodded gravely. What you're describing goes beyond selective amnesia. It's as if he's losing access to the very concept of personal identity. The medical term would be existential confusion, a complete disconnection from one's sense of self. Is there anything you can do? Ruth asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. I'm not sure this is strictly a medical condition, Whitmore admitted. The patterns I'm observing don't match any documented neurological disorder. There's something else at work here, something that requires a different kind of understanding. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the floor. Doctor, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have mentioned before. What is it? I've been having dreams. Every night since this started. Dreams about my grandfather Jeremiah. Whitmore leaned forward, his scientific skepticism warring with the growing certainty that conventional explanations were inadequate. Tell me about these dreams. Thomas's hands began to shake as he spoke. He comes to me in the dark hours before dawn, looking exactly as he did in the old daguerreotype my mother kept. But his eyes are wrong. Empty, like they're looking at something that isn't there. What does he say? That the debt comes due with interest, Thomas replied, his voice barely audible. He tells me that what he started must be finished, that each generation's sacrifice feeds something ancient. Something that lives in the spaces between thoughts. Ruth gripped her husband's arm. Thomas, you never told me. How could I? He looked at his wife with anguished eyes. How could I tell you that our prosperity, everything we've built, comes from some unholy bargain made by a man who died before we were born? Whitmore felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a picture that his rational mind wanted to reject. What exactly did Jeremiah sacrifice? According to the dreams, he gave up his ability to pray, to connect with the divine. My father sacrificed his capacity for joy. Thomas paused, struggling with the admission. I gave up my hope. I haven't believed in tomorrow for years, Doctor. Every day feels like the last one, like nothing good can ever happen again. And Silas? He's giving up everything, Thomas whispered. His entire self. Jeremiah says it's the final payment, the one that will satisfy the debt forever. But what takes his place? He shuddered. What takes his place won't be human anymore. A crash from the kitchen interrupted their conversation, followed by Ruth's sharp intake of breath. They rushed back to find Silas standing before the small mirror that hung beside the wash basin, his body rigid with tension. He was pointing frantically at his reflection, then looking around the room as if searching for something he couldn't find. What's wrong? Whitmore asked, approaching carefully. The boy continued his frantic pointing, his mouth opening and closing in silent distress. He seemed to be trying to locate the source of the reflection in the mirror, unable to understand that the image was his own. His eyes darted around the room, searching every corner, every shadow, as if the person in the mirror must be hiding somewhere nearby. Whitmore watched in fascination and horror as Silas reached out to touch the mirror's surface, then pulled his hand back when he realized the reflection mimicked his movement. The boy's expression was one of genuine bewilderment, as if he were witnessing some impossible magic trick that defied comprehension. He doesn't recognize himself, Whitmore breathed. He's looking at his own reflection and seeing a stranger. Silas began backing away from the mirror, his pointing becoming more agitated. He bumped into his chair and nearly fell, his coordination failing as panic overtook his usual mechanical precision. The sight of his own face had become genuinely frightening to him, a reminder of something he could no longer access or understand. Cover it, Ruth said urgently. Cover the mirror. Thomas quickly draped a dish towel over the glass, and immediately Silas's agitation subsided. He returned to his chair and resumed his hand-washing ritual, but Whitmore noticed that his movements were faster now, more desperate, as if the encounter with his reflection had intensified whatever invisible contamination he was trying to cleanse. "Doctor," Ruth whispered, "what's happening to our son?" Whitmore stared at the boy who sat before them, mechanically washing hands that belonged to someone he no longer recognized. The medical journals he had studied at Harvard contained no explanations for what he was witnessing. This was something that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional science, something that required him to consider possibilities he had never imagined. "I believe," he said slowly, choosing his words with great care, "that Silas is being systematically erased. Not just his memories or his personality, but his very existence as an individual entity. Something is consuming his identity piece by piece, leaving behind only the most basic functions necessary to sustain life." "But why?" Thomas asked, though his haunted expression suggested he already knew the answer. "Because something else needs that space," Whitmore replied, the terrible understanding settling over him like a shroud. "Something that feeds on human identity and grows stronger with each soul it consumes." As if in response to his words, Silas looked up from his washing and smiled at them with that empty, pleasant expression that had become so familiar. But for just a moment, in the depths of his pale blue eyes, Whitmore thought he saw something else looking back, something ancient and patient and utterly inhuman. "If you discovered that your family's prosperity came from a supernatural bargain, would you try to break it, or would you accept the price?" The wind howled through the bare branches outside the Hartwell cottage as Dr. Whitmore paced the small parlor, his mind racing through the impossible revelations of the past few days. Thomas sat hunched in his chair, staring into the dying embers of the fire, while upstairs they could hear the soft sounds of Silas moving about his room, or what they hoped was still Silas. "There has to be something we're missing," Whitmore muttered, running his hands through his hair. "Some record, some explanation that makes sense of all this." Thomas looked up with hollow eyes. "My grandfather's cabin is still standing, about a mile into the woods. Been abandoned since he died, but—" He paused, seeming to gather courage. "Maybe there's something there. Something he left behind." The cabin sat in a clearing that felt wrong somehow, as if the very air were thicker there, resistant to natural movement. Bare trees surrounded the structure like silent sentinels, their branches reaching toward the gray sky with gnarled fingers. The building itself was surprisingly well preserved for having been abandoned for nearly 50 years, its logs still solid and its roof intact despite decades of Vermont winters. Whitmore pushed open the heavy wooden door, which creaked on rusted hinges but swung freely. Inside, dust motes danced in the pale afternoon light that filtered through grimy windows. The single room contained the basic furnishings of a hermit's existence: a narrow bed, a rough table, a stone fireplace blackened with soot. But what drew Whitmore's attention was the floor near the far wall, where several boards seemed to sit slightly higher than the rest. "Thomas," he called, kneeling beside the suspicious planks. "Help me with these." Together they pried up the loose floorboards, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and stained with age, along with what appeared to be carved wooden tokens covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. Whitmore lifted the journal with trembling hands and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and precise, the script of an educated man, but as he read aloud, the words seemed to carry a weight that pressed down on both men like a physical force. September 12, 1788. "I have found what I sought in the deep places where civilized men fear to tread. The entity that dwells between identity and void has agreed to my proposal. The price is steep, but the reward is invisibility from divine judgment. My bloodline will prosper in temporal matters while remaining hidden from God's accounting." Thomas gripped the edge of the table. "Invisibility from judgment? What does that mean?" Whitmore turned the page, his voice growing more strained as he continued reading. October 3, 1788. "The bargain is sealed. Each generation of my line will surrender something precious to the unnamed. I have already felt the change. I can no longer pray, can no longer feel the presence of the divine. But the emptiness where my faith once lived is filling with something else, something that whispers of power and prosperity. The entries that followed chronicled Jeremiah's gradual transformation as whatever he had summoned began to inhabit the spaces left by his sacrificed spirituality. His handwriting became increasingly erratic, the letters sometimes trailing off into symbols that resembled the carvings on the wooden tokens. December 15, 1788, Whitmore read, his voice now barely above a whisper. The unnamed grows stronger with each feeding. My son will give up his joy, his grandson his hope. But the final sacrifice, the one that completes our family's debt, must be total. One child will give up everything, name, memory, identity itself. In return, the unnamed will have a vessel through which to experience human existence, and my bloodline will be free to prosper without divine interference for 7 generations. Thomas stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. That's Silas. He's talking about Silas. There's more, Whitmore said grimly, turning to an entry near the journal's end. January 2, 1789. I understand now what I have done. The unnamed does not simply consume identity, it collects it, stores it, uses it to build something new. The child who makes the final sacrifice will not die. He will become something else entirely, a perfect vessel for an ancient hunger that feeds on human selfhood. The handwriting in the final entries was almost illegible, words scrawled across the page as if written by someone in the grip of madness or possession. The child will walk among them, appearing human but hollow inside, collecting names and memories like a child collects stones. Each identity consumed makes the unnamed stronger, until it no longer needs to hide between thoughts, it can walk openly in the world, wearing faces that were never its own. A sound from upstairs interrupted Whitmore's reading, not the familiar creaking of floorboards under human feet, but something heavier and more deliberate, as if furniture were being moved with careful precision. Both men froze, listening to the rhythmic sounds that seemed to follow some pattern they couldn't quite grasp. What is he doing up there? Thomas whispered. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete that it seemed to echo in their ears. Then came a new sound, the unmistakable creak of a window being opened, followed by a rush of cold air that they could feel even from downstairs. They rushed up the narrow staircase, their boots clattering on the wooden steps. Silas's room was empty, but not in the way they had expected. His clothes lay neatly folded on the bed, every garment he had been wearing, arranged with mathematical precision as if prepared for some ceremony. His small shoes sat beside the bed, laces carefully tied. Even his undergarments had been folded and stacked with ritualistic care. The window stood wide open, its frame forming a perfect rectangle of gray winter sky. Snow had blown in, creating a small drift on the windowsill, but there were no signs of struggle, no indication that the opening had been forced. "Dear God," Thomas breathed, touching the folded clothes. "Where is he?" Whitmore leaned out the window, scanning the ground below. In the snow beneath Silas's window, a single line of small footprints led away from the house toward the cemetery on the hill. But something was wrong with the prints, they seemed too shallow, as if made by someone who weighed almost nothing. "There," he pointed. He went toward the cemetery. They climbed down from the window, following the trail through the deepening snow. The footprints were indeed strange, perfectly formed but barely indenting the surface, as if their maker had been walking on the snow rather than through it. More disturbing still, the prints seemed to grow fainter with each step, not from being filled by falling snow, but as if the feet making them were becoming less solid, less substantial. "Look at this," Whitmore said, kneeling beside one of the later prints. "It's as if he's fading." The trail led them up the familiar path to the cemetery, but as they climbed higher, the footprints became increasingly difficult to see. By the time they reached the cemetery gates, only the faintest impressions remained in the snow, so light they might have been made by a child's spirit rather than a living boy. The last footprint stopped abruptly before Jeremiah Hartwell's weathered gravestone, the same monument where they had found Silas that first morning. Beyond that point, there were no tracks at all, not because they had been covered, but because they simply ceased to exist. Thomas fell to his knees beside his grandfather's grave, his hands scrabbling in the snow as if he could somehow recover his son from the frozen ground. "Silas," he called out, his voice echoing across the empty cemetery. "Silas, come back." But there was no answer except the wind through the bare trees, and Whitmore realized with growing horror that the name Thomas was calling might no longer belong to anyone at all. Whatever had once been Silas Hartwell had completed his transformation somewhere between the house and this ancient stone, becoming something else entirely, something that no longer needed to leave footprints in the snow. As darkness began to fall over Millfield, Whitmore found himself staring at the empty space beyond the gravestone where the footprints simply ended, and he understood that they were no longer dealing with a missing child. They were dealing with something that had been systematically emptied of everything human and filled with something far older and infinitely more patient. The unnamed had finally found its perfect vessel, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, it was learning what it meant to be human. 3 months had passed since the night Silas Hartwell's footprints vanished into nothing beside his grandfather's grave, and Dr. Whitmore found himself completing what would become the most disturbing medical case study in Vermont history. His leather-bound journal lay open before him, filled with observations that challenged everything he had once believed about the nature of human existence and the boundaries between the possible and the impossible. The reports had begun filtering in during the second week of March, when the snow finally started to melt and reveal the secrets winter had hidden. Ezekiel Morrison claimed he'd seen a pale figure moving through the woods behind his property, walking between the trees without disturbing the branches, as if it existed in the same space but not quite the same reality. Sarah Blackwood insisted she'd encountered a thin child near the creek who had spoken her secret name, the one her grandmother had whispered to her on her deathbed, the name no living person should have known. More sightings followed, each stranger than the last. Benjamin Morrison swore he'd seen the same figure in 3 different locations simultaneously, by the mill, near the church, and walking along the main road, all at exactly the same time. The entity appeared to exist at the edge of perception, visible from the corner of one's eye but somehow shifting just beyond direct sight when observed closely. It was young Timothy Morrison who finally provided Whitmore with the encounter he needed to complete his study. The boy came running to the doctor's office on a gray April morning, his face flushed with excitement and terror in equal measure. "Dr. Whitmore," he gasped, bursting through the door without knocking. "I found him. I found the Hartwell boy." Whitmore set down his pen and turned his full attention to the child. "Where, Timothy? Where did you see him?" "In the old cemetery, sitting by that broken gravestone near the back." "But doctor." Timothy's voice dropped to a whisper. "He's different now. He looks the same but wrong, like a picture that's been drawn by someone who's never seen a real person before." Against his better judgment, Whitmore followed Timothy through the village and up the familiar path to the cemetery. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the weathered headstones, creating patterns of light and darkness that seemed to shift and move when he wasn't looking directly at them. They found the figure exactly where Timothy had indicated, sitting cross-legged before a crumbling monument whose inscription had been worn away by decades of weather. The creature that had once been Silas Hartwell looked up as they approached, and Whitmore felt his breath catch in his throat. The physical form was recognizable, the same pale blue eyes, the same delicate features, the same small frame, but something fundamental had changed. The boy sat with perfect stillness, his posture unnaturally straight, his hands folded in his lap with mathematical precision. Most disturbing of all, he cast no shadow despite the bright afternoon sun. "Good afternoon, Dr. Ezra Whitmore," the figure said, its voice carrying the same tone Silas had always used but with an underlying resonance that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than his throat. And young Timothy Morrison, son of Ezekiel and Mary, born on the feast day of St. Bartholomew. Timothy stepped backward, clutching Whitmore's coat. How does he know that? I never told anyone when my birthday was. The creature tilted its head with bird-like curiosity. I know many things now, Timothy Morrison. I know that your mother hides coins beneath the loose floorboard in your kitchen. I know that your father speaks to his dead brother when he thinks no one is listening. I know the name your grandmother gave you in secret, Aurelius, after the Roman emperor whose writings she treasured. That's impossible, Whitmore said, though his voice carried no conviction. How could you know such things? I collect them, the entity replied matter-of-factly. Names and secrets and the small truths that make people real to each other. They taste different, each one unique, like varieties of fruit from an endless orchard. Whitmore forced himself to approach closer, his scientific mind cataloging details even as his deeper instincts screamed warnings. The creature's skin held an alabaster quality that seemed to glow with its own internal light. Its eyes, while maintaining Silas's familiar blue color, reflected nothing, not the sky, not the surrounding trees, not even Whitmore's own image as he leaned closer. Tell me about yourself, Whitmore said carefully. What is your name? The creature's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something that might have been confusion crossing its features. I have had many names. Dr. Whitmore. I have been called the Unnamed, the Hollow Walker, the Gatherer of Selves. But the name you seek. It paused, its head tilting further as if trying to recall something just beyond its grasp. There was a name that belonged to this form before I inhabited it, but it has been consumed along with everything else that made it distinct. Silas, Whitmore said softly. The name was Silas Hartwell. Silas, the creature repeated, rolling the syllables around as if tasting something foreign. Silas Hartwell. No, I know all the names in this village, but that combination means nothing to me. It produces no recognition, no memory, no connection to this form I wear. Timothy tugged at Whitmore's sleeve. Doctor, look at his feet. Whitmore glanced down and felt his stomach lurch. The creature cast no shadow, but neither did it leave any impression in the soft earth beneath it. It sat upon the ground without truly touching it, existing in the physical space but somehow separate from the material world. You're not human anymore, are you? Whitmore asked. I was never human, the entity replied. But this vessel remembers being human, and through it, I am learning what that means. I am learning about connection and loss, about love and fear, about the thousand small threads that bind one consciousness to another. And what do you do with that knowledge? The creature smiled, and for a moment its expression held an echo of the innocent child Silas had once been. I feed. Each name I collect, each identity I consume, makes me stronger and more complete. The humans I touch gradually forget themselves, becoming empty vessels that I can fill with purpose. You're stealing their identities? Not stealing, the entity corrected gently. Erasing. When I consume someone's true self, it's as if they never existed at all. The connections that define them disappear, the memories others held of them fade, and reality adjusts itself to accommodate their absence. Whitmore thought of Thomas and Ruth Hartwell, and a terrible suspicion began to form in his mind. The boy's parents. Thomas and Ruth Hartwell, the creature said, nodding. A childless couple who have lived in their cottage for 15 years, working and surviving and slowly growing old together. They have never had children, Dr. Whitmore. The village records show no birth, no baptism, no mention of any offspring from their union. But I remember. You remember because you were not present at the moment of consumption, the entity explained. Your memories remain intact because you were not connected to the vessel through bonds of blood or daily intimacy. But ask anyone else in the village about the Hartwell child, and they will look at you with confusion. No such child ever existed. The full horror of what had happened began to dawn on Whitmore. Not only had Silas been consumed and replaced, but his very existence had been retroactively erased from the world. Everyone who had known him as family or friend had been altered, their memories adjusted to remove any trace of the boy who had once lived among them. How many others? Whitmore asked, though he dreaded the answer. I am still learning, the creature said. Still growing. Each identity consumed teaches me new ways to understand human connection, new methods of feeding. Soon I will be strong enough to move beyond this small village, to walk among larger populations where the feast of names and memories is more abundant. Timothy had begun crying silently, though he seemed unable to articulate why. Some instinctive part of his child's mind recognized the wrongness of what sat before them, the fundamental violation of natural order that the creature represented. You're going to consume everyone, Whitmore realized. Eventually. Not everyone, the entity corrected. Some will serve other purposes. Some will become vessels like this one, hollow forms for others of my kind to inhabit. Humanity will continue to exist, Dr. Whitmore, but it will exist to serve our hunger rather than its own desires. The creature stood with fluid grace, rising from the ground without any visible effort. As it moved, the air around it seemed to shimmer slightly, as if reality itself was uncertain about the space it occupied. I must continue my work, it said, its voice carrying an almost apologetic tone. There are so many names yet to collect, so many identities yet to taste. But before I go, Dr. Whitmore, let me offer you a gift. What kind of gift? Forgetfulness, the entity said simply. I can take away your memories of all this, the boy who never existed, the investigation that led nowhere, the medical case that defied explanation. You could return to your normal practice, treating broken bones and delivering babies, never again troubled by knowledge too terrible to bear. Whitmore felt the temptation like a physical weight. To forget everything he had witnessed, to return to a world where such impossibilities could not exist, where his rational mind could rest easy in its certainty about the nature of reality. No, he said finally. Someone has to remember. Someone has to document what happened here, even if no one believes it. The creature nodded as if it had expected this response. Very well. Then remember, Dr. Whitmore. Remember that some hungers grow stronger with each feeding, that some voids can never be filled, and that humanity's greatest strength, its capacity for connection and identity, may also prove to be its ultimate vulnerability. With that, the entity began walking away, moving between the gravestones with that peculiar gait that disturbed nothing it passed. Whitmore watched until it disappeared among the trees, wondering if he would ever see it again or if it would simply fade into legend like so many other inexplicable events in human history. That night, he completed his final journal entry, recording every detail he could remember about the case that had consumed 3 months of his life and challenged every assumption he held about the nature of existence. He wrote about the boy who had swallowed his own name and never spoke again, about the entity that fed on human identity itself, and about the terrible realization that some hungers could never be satisfied. When he finished writing, Dr. Whitmore closed his journal and placed it in the locked drawer of his desk, knowing that it contained knowledge too dangerous to share but too important to destroy. Somewhere in the Vermont wilderness, something that had once been human was learning new ways to feed, growing stronger with each name it collected, each identity it consumed. And in a small cottage at the edge of Millfield, Thomas and Ruth Hartwell sat by their fire, a childless couple who had never known the joy and terror of parenthood, their memories adjusted to accommodate a reality where their son had never existed at all. If you stayed with this story to the end, comment, some hungers can never be federal.